Due to technical difficulties, audio will not be heard for several slides. Jump to the minute and 15-second mark if you would like to begin where the audio recording starts. Due to technical difficulties, audio will not be heard for several slides. Jump to the minute and 15-second mark if you would like to begin where the audio recording starts.
If you're getting another round of grants, it's really easy to forget that you're going to have to actually assign all the users there. So in a lot of places, we actually have grantees with NSP, versus disaster, and the disaster for the first grant might be a separate team than the disaster for the second grant. So it's up to you, which of your users actually work with which grants. And the other basic process, this screen is very similar. If it's here, this is a grantee admin screen, but the HUD CPD rep has a similar screen. The field managers also have similar screens, but basically this is the screen for the original certifications and the recertifications. And if someone's actually expired, they're going to show in that bottom right. And the thing to remember is that a lot of times you actually have to scroll down to actually view that. So it might be cut off on your screen, because I get plenty of emails saying, I don't see the users. And I'll tell them, look on the right-hand side, move down, and they're like, oh, this is amazing, it wasn't there. So a person that's in the top right they will get a notice when they log in. I think it's about a month long, and for a month they'll say, you're expiring, and that typically we don't get a notice, oh, someone needs to recertify me until that 6 months, not to the 6 months, until the end of the period. But in order to make sure someone's certified, they'll have to actually move to the top right, over to the top left, and then the key is hitting the save changes. It sounds common sense, but again, that's a very common error, is people will go ahead and do it, forget to hit save, and it just doesn't, it's not done. So it might be a little confusing. One of the most difficult things might be to try to figure out, well, who certifies me? If you're a regular grantee admin user, you're actually going to be certified by your grantee admin user. If you're an admin user, you're certified by your CPD rep, whoever's assigned to your grant in DRGR. So, because you can see there's a whole cascading, level of certifications. I certify the field managers certify the field staff. But that's because I wouldn't know, somebody that's a regular grantee user, 9 times out of 10. So we've got this where somebody that's just above them in the process will be the person certifying them. In Release 7.3, we do have the ability of field managers to serve as backup for grantee admin users, for certifying grantee admin users, but always, that's really if your CPD rep's out of town, on vacation, on travel, whatever. So basic roles for HUD, we have a regular user versus HUD view only user. Regular user is someone that can actually review action plans and QPRs. And if someone else has view rights, not view rights, if someone else is in the same field office, it's not only your CPD rep that actually can review an action plan or review QPR. So again, other folks in that office have the ability to do it. So the only ones that wouldn't would be, again, those inspector general users that are actually view only rights. So some of the rules that we have, as HUD is that if we've got a checkbox for folks if we approve draws, and basically we set those by appropriation. Tennille ends up handling a lot of the draws over threshold if it's disaster. I serve as backup, and if we're not available, then it's Miss Jessie. But for NSP, we've got separate folks, and I think Jim Yerden's probably the lead on reviewing, draws over threshold. So again, Debbie's actually, Debbie, myself, and Ryan have administrator HHQ admin, which is basically setting up profiles, and then we have super user accounts where we actually set up the screens and customize them for NSP versus disaster, and now we actually have technical assistance grants in the system too. So this is the same kind of chart that just basically shows, what rights do we have. So one thing that's common to most users now that wasn't a few years back ago was viewing QPRs and viewing action plans. A lot of times HUD staff would have review screens, but they didn't even have view screens. Grantees, once an action plan was submitted, couldn't even see their own action plan. So we made view a common thing, and we also added the download PDF screens, because we were having to copy and paste web pages, put them into a Word document, save them as PDF. And so since, especially on the QPR side, since you're required to post, approved QPRs, we wanted to make that a bit of an easier process for you. So real quickly, some of the reports that are helpful in MicroStrategy is the grantee user account status is a master list of anybody that's listed for you. If you don't see a user and you've been told the user is actually there, and has been added, and they don't show up, it might be that we've added them under the wrong grantee profile. We do have some duplicate profiles in the system that we can't get rid of easily. So if you want to know whether or not what their roles are and whether or not they're certified or not, admin report 4B is something that anybody can pull. So if someone's saying, again, I can't get in, before you contact the help desk, you can always pull an admin report 4B. If they can't see a grant, you can pull 4C. The one thing to remember about these reports and almost any other, if someone hasn't been associated with something, if a user hasn't been assigned to that grant, they're not even going to show up on that report. So the fact is you'll know that they weren't assigned to the grant because they will not show up on the report. So they'll show up on 4A, but they will not show up on 4C. So I think most of the folks show up on 4B. Oh, that's interesting. So this is just an example of 4B, which shows on the right-hand side the system role, shows when they were recertified, if they were, when was the last time. So again, what happens typically is those things come in 6-month cycles, so if folks are starting to do it, it might be helpful to go pull a report just to make sure, let me go ahead and just certify everybody at once. That way you're not doing it based on individual email requests. Or if you might set a tickler up for yourself in Outlook or something that says, reminder, I think the 6 months are going to expire around here. So we won't go into depth about this, but basically, if you haven't heard it before, and I apologize for repeating it over and over, but it's important. Don't use your back button on the browser. And you have a bad connection, and you get out, you're having a hard time getting back in. So if 20 or 30 minutes goes by and you still can't get back in, that's when you contact DRGR help desk. You ask for a session reset, and we'll do that for you. We have to log in, hit a little button. So the save early, save often, that really applies more to CPD reps than anybody else. Grantees, DRGR forces you go down to the activity level to edit data. For CPD reps, when they're doing reviews on an action plan in QPR, it's one big document. And so DRGR doesn't know that you're actually putting data in until you hit save or submit. So a lot of times, more times than I can care to count, CPD reps filled out all their comments, went to get a drink of water or something, and then they're all cleared out because the session's gone. So if that happens, then and it happens on a recurring basis, I will say, copy it into Word or Notepad, things like that. And so the Word Notepad thing is really important to remember too, when it comes to your action plan and your narratives, things like that, and even your activity profile narratives, your QPR. If you copy stuff directly from Microsoft Word, it has actually got HTML in it. So those carriage returns, or heaven forbid you put a table in, because that's like a ton of carriage returns. Those will actually, if you have whole parts of your action plan or QPR disappear, it's because some of that code has gotten embedded in. So if you are copying and pasting, I know it's tempting, you want to keep that format you had in that Word document, but it's better to go ahead and paste it in from the text, from Notepad, and then format it once it's in DRGR. So that's always the big clue. Is that, stuff disappears. It's not disappeared, it's just not displaying in the view and the review screens. So real quick, the general process in DRGR is, again, what happens when you sign a grant agreement, it's going to go to Fort Worth. They actually put data information into PASS and locks, the financial disbursement systems. It generates profiles of grantees and grants for us in DRGR. We set up accounts associated with those grantee profiles. And then again, you're setting up action plans. When you set up an action plan with the activities, all that information on the activity side never goes over to locks. So when you're setting those up for a drawdown, It's just so we can track where you're spending the money for who you say you're distributing the money to. And then on the QPR side. But when we actually send information to locks during the drawdown process, it's going to roll it up to per voucher. Here's how much dollars goes to Treasury, from Treasury to your account for a particular voucher. None of that information on the activity side actually goes over. So that's one of the reasons we can do things like a revised voucher, where we can make corrections, things like that. So real quickly, in terms of the process, you'll see things that are actually document status, that we have the same document status types for action plan versus QPRs. And the main thing to remember about your document status, it tells you whether or not you can edit something. It tells you whether or not HUD can review it. So when something's first drafted, whether it's an action plan or QPR, it'll say original in progress. As soon as you submit that, it goes submitted to wait for review. You can no longer edit those documents. If you've made a mistake, you basically have to tell your CPD rep, hey, do you mind rejecting it, without review, and someone will just make a note of that. Could be that you need desperately to add an activity because you got to do a draw. Anyway, it's submitted. If there's any modifications needed, it goes into rejected. Wait for modification. Some grantees seem to think that that's a bad thing to see a rejected QPR, but I don't know that we think of it from that perspective. It just means there's some changes that need to be made, either on your side that you request or that we've made. When it gets rejected, it goes back into modified, resubmit when ready, goes back into submitted status, and then the final thing is reviewed and approved. So the main thing to remember, about this, past this again, is other than who can see what when and who can take what actions, is that an action plan has to be in approved status again before you can submit a QPR. You can edit a QPR. You can add a QPR. You're just not going to be able to submit it, I think, if I remember correctly. And vice versa, when your QPR is submitted, your action plan's in lockdown status. Because the action plan is pulling data from the drawdown module, it's pulling from the action plan module, and it has to have kind of a history at that time. So those things kind of get locked down. So that's basically it for the general process, the flow across systems, across modules. What I'm going to cover next is the action plan module, and I didn't mention it at the beginning, but we'll kind of wait on the questions till the very end, because my experience with the DRGR, if we open it for questions during the time, we get so many that it gets hard to get through the actual presentation itself. So in the action plan module, we're going to cover real quickly adding projects, adding activities. Responsible organizations is listed below here, but you want to do that before you add activities. You want to do projects before you do activities. And then submitting the action plan. This slide here, what I'm trying to illustrate here is that it used to be way back in the early days, action plan, everything was pretty much just adding an activity. Some of the things that have changed is we've actually made responsible organizations of being a separate database. That way you can actually have one record for an organization, say it's the City of New Orleans, City of Atlanta, and then you would actually point to that each time instead of just typing in the name. And the reason for that is we had to start trying to track information like DUNS numbers, TIN numbers, things like that. So adding activity, you actually have to be in the Edit Action Plan screen to add an activity. So it's a button. When you're working on projects or responsible organizations, whether it's add or searching to edit them, those are going to be in those left-hand links. So that gets a little confusing for folks because it's a little bit different navigation for each. The process, again, is a grantee is going to add an action plan. In general, they're going to add a project next. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but projects basically typically tend to be whatever's in your published plan. And a lot of times it's a higher level grouping. It's a method of distribution if you're a state. I'm going to spend this much on housing, this much on economic development, this much on infrastructure, and this much on admin. So a lot of times that's going to go in as a project. If you have not made awards at all to local governments or nonprofits, things like that, your data is only going to be at the project level. Drawdowns are at the activity level. So you're not going to be able to do drawdowns. So early days, if you've got an early grant and you haven't made awards, the only one you might have is admin. State admin, local admin, things like that. Because sometimes that's the first activity to hit. So again, the purpose of the action plan is creating that template for drawdowns for reporting. The steps, again, you're going to confirm the grant number when you add the action plan. You're going to add some narrative, add projects, add activities after you add responsible organizations, and then you'll submit it to HUD for approval. One thing to remember, again, I've just mentioned that you might not know everybody you award at the very beginning of your grant. So one of the things to remember is that an action plan is not final. If a CPD rep hasn't reviewed action plans before in DRGR, they change, they're ongoing. People rebudget, but typically we don't see at the activity level everything budgeted out at the very beginning of a grant. It's pretty rare, especially for states. They might stand up one program at a time. I think Mississippi and Louisiana especially, it was their action plans and amendments were program by program. So we would see a big chunk at a time. And then with Ike and the Midwest flood, the grants, the B08 grants, we also had round 1 and round 2. So we just keep adding and adding, grantees add and add activities as they go. So we've already talked about what causes a problem if you don't, if you can't edit an action plan. Typically it's because the action plan's in submitted status, the QPR is in submitted status. Another one we talked about, again, is it might be that the grantee, if you don't see the grant in the drop-down when you're doing it, it could be that the user has not been assigned to the grant. It could be that the grant is not active. We might, when it comes into the system, it's actually listed as dormant. And so we actually have to be reminded sometimes, hey, why in the world is my grant listed as dormant? So when we're editing those grant pages, sometimes the status might accidentally change. And again, the user could have view only, but that's a pretty rare instance. When someone's actually getting to access the action plan, it's not real intuitive. You actually are going to click on the link under the action plan status column in order to access that document. So the links, again, are going to show just like the statuses we've talked about. So here for Fulton County, Georgia, if you want to edit B08 UN 13004 grant action plan, you're going to click on that word, modify, resubmit when ready. And so when you first get your grant come into the system, it's always going to say overdue. There's no due date, unless Neil and Scott tell you there's a due date. But from a system perspective, we don't have a due date. It's just what they end up calling it. So you click on the overdue. It says here's the grant, and it just asks you to confirm. So you might want to make sure the grant amount shows correctly, that we didn't transpose a number, things like that. But basically, that's as simple as it is on that one step. The confirm grant process is not much. So again, here we show the links. When you start wanting to add activities later on, you're going to see that add activity button. If you want to edit an activity, you're going to actually click on the activity number to edit the existing activity. And it used to be that we had a huge long list, and it was we have so many grantees with so many activities. I think Texas, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Iowa end up with hundreds of activities. And so they're having to scroll down, and typically they're codes. A lot of times they're finance code for the activity number. So it can be a little difficult to navigate. So we tried to improve that a little bit under this last release by adding some expanding and collapsing projects. If this is a little confusing, if you have not assigned any activity to a project, the project will not show up in that index. You can still search project and it'll show them, but it won't just automatically show up until you've assigned activities. So this is probably not common, but I think we're trying to emphasize a little bit more. There is an ability for you to report other types of funds. If you're leveraging, if you're trying to show that you're having an impact beyond the disaster recovery funds, then one of the things you can do is identify additional fund sources. And so when you do that, you actually have to do it on the action plan level. If you don't do this little step, when you go to the edit activity page, it won't show fund types. It's kind of a two-step process to show additional funds. What we don't have is on the QPR side, where it shows right now, and here's how much going by that source. We just have one data field called match. And so we're talking about changing that and making sure, trying to figure out what we need to do to try to make sure that we show the leveraging funds, in a way that's suitable and that's helpful. So for most disaster grantees, they're going to see these two data fields, disaster damage and recovery needs. And this is an example of the area where you see the formatting, the bold, the italicized, numbers. This is one of the ones you have to be super careful. If it doesn't have that formatting, it's not a big issue. But this says, I accept HTML code. And so this is one of those places where if you copy and paste from Word, or a web page or something like that, that you can run into trouble. And we'll talk about that later on, but the basic way is you have to delete it out. To fix it, you have to delete it out, save it, and then come back in and paste it from the text-only thing like Notepad. So projects, it's a little confusing, again, because a lot of times even, especially if you're in an entitlement program, you might call everything an activity in your published plan. And so, again, projects are usually those major groupings. It's your method of distribution or the high-level groupings that you've put in your published plans and amendments. So it's a little hard concept to get around a little bit sometimes. It's only a grouping. So since it is a grouping, it's going to be a drop-down once you create those groupings and those budgets. It'll become a drop-down in the Edit Activity page. If you don't have it, you can't save your activity. If you don't have your responsible organizations created, which I'll show you how, you can't save that activity because you have to go back in and do those edits first. So this is an example again. So housing, you might have a few different cities, and typically what we say is that when you're splitting activities, you need to have a separate activity for every organization you fund, and by responsible organization we mean who is managing that activity from a day-to-day basis. A lot of times grantees will say, well, I'm the grantee, I'm the responsible organization. If you've awarded the funds to a local government, you know, if you're an entitlement and you award it to a subrecipient, those are the responsible organizations from a DRGR perspective. You have to list them. If you fund separate types of activities to that organization, you need to list them separately. For housing, typically single-family housing, we also ask you to split upper income and lower income so we can track that for calculating your overall benefit and whether or not someone meets a national objective of low mod. And so a lot of times we'll see urgent need and low mod at the end of the activity titles. The other thing that some of y'all, for the BOE grants, you're going to see, we might not have cleared them all out. We have a concept of a restricted balance project. When a grant starts, before an action plan's been reviewed, it's blocked for draws. We have a few different ways to do that. One is we just have a block at the grant level, and then we also have what's called a restricted balance project. And so for folks that had round 1 and round 2, you know, you might not have had a published plan that's approved by HUD for round 2. And so we would leave those amounts in the restricted balance. You can add activities to them. You just will never be able to draw against them. So if you have a hard time drawing against something, that's one thing to look at is, do I have a restricted balance project, and is the activity assigned to it? If that's the case, and it shouldn't be for any of the B10 grants. I think they're all one round, one amount. So all those should be zeroed out restricted balances, but they will, again, all start as blocked for draws. But work with your CPD rep and then contact us again through DRGR help. So the project screen is actually pretty simple. It doesn't contain a whole lot of information. And it's basically which grant are you, what's your project number, and the project numbers, activity numbers, that's up to you. I think there's a 50-character limit, but typically what we see from grantees is folks have finance departments and they have accounting codes. State of Florida uses IAS matrix codes. They use abbreviations for the counties and the cities. A lot of the folks just actually use numerical codes. Some people make the activity number and activity title the same, project number, project title, but I typically say that the numbers typically are better for codes, for tracking stuff. The project titles and the activity titles typically I think is better to use for like when you're going to print out a QPR, something that's going to be more descriptive maybe for your public, the folks looking at it. So we talked a little bit about the revolving loan fund. That's all it is a checkbox there. So the key thing is if you've got other activities on that revolving loan fund, those are going to have to migrate to another one. So if you have economic development as a project, but you're doing as one of your things under economic development as a revolving loan fund, you'll have to do a separate revolving loan fund project. And again, if it's housing, it might be then it's housing rehab, revolving loan fund LM, housing, you know, for an activity, housing rehab UN for a second activity. That's typically what we see. So we talked about the typical reasons for breaking out an activity, responsible organization, activity type, national objective. If it's multifamily, we expect a separate activity for each complex. And the reason, again, for this is similar to what we talked about for single family. We're going to be checking a low mod and multifamily in the way they do with regular CDBG. It's based on that complex. What's the percent of low mod people in that complex? So it's not necessarily every address at a complex, but it is, you know, for the entire program. So what we wouldn't want to see is if you're a state, see one activity and then it says organizations to be determined, or will be awarded to local governments. that would mean it's many activities. And so I think Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida too, and Texas, everybody's got usually the complex name in the activity titles, typically what we see. So national objective, we talked about that. Typically, we only see that on the single-family side in the activity title. It helps a little bit when people are running reports and they want to do their own analysis. So again, the key thing to remember is that we're capturing information on the funding. The reason we're breaking things down to this level is we're tracking, what if you're meeting your affordable rental requirements, if you're meeting your low mod requirements, your admin caps. By tracking things at that activity type, we're not only checking those activity level tests, but we're also checking your overall spending. So that's one of the reasons we actually do a review, a lot of times an action plan review checklist in advance of actually unblocking your grant. It's much easier to fix on the front end than the back end. The back end, you have to revise 80 million draws, and it's a nightmare. So we actually make people go through a little extra step. Responsible organization, again, it's through the add link on the left. It's not complicated. You just put a profile of information. The required information is DUNS information, the TIN number. But basically, it's some information that we kind of have mirrored from FFATA, the Federal Financial Accountability Transparency Act, because we need to know, in our system, we're sometimes called to check, the data to say, who are you distributing your money to? So we added that, I think, maybe in April 2010 or April 2010. Yes, ma'am.
Questions that we got yesterday was about, we wanted to be able to exchange data with and so that people don't have to report in two systems. And I'm pretty sure we're still stuck reporting in two systems now.
Yeah.
We are trying to set up a DRGR, right, so that someday when they're ready, we can just exchange.
Well, that's one of the reasons we actually built that function, responsible organization function in advance. We did think we were going to end up doing that for you. But OMB, I think if I understand correctly, if I remember the process, OMB just said, no, we're building a system and you're going to use it. So, but then we also have been told, we expect to reconcile it, our data, with your data. So the responsible organizations there, I don't know, I think there is, admin report 5B or something like that, where you can actually look at them, a master list and not listed by activity. So one of the things to keep an eye out is, do we have multiples? When you're adding an activity on page 2 is where you're basically going to say, are you undertaking this activity yourself? If it's not, that's where you're going to pick, that other responsible organization. The thing to remember here is we do have this function called a subordinate organization function. That's not to be used for multiple local governments. That's not to be used for subrecipients. If the grantee wants to track, maybe I want to spend, how much spending is for this contractor or that contractor, that's an option there. Because at one point, again, we were told we were going to have to track anything over 25,000. So for the most part, stay away from that function, And the only reason I say that is that if you put that function in, as soon as you add those levels of detail, you're going to be reporting at that level from then on. So unless there's the need that you want to go down to that level, I'd say, stay away from that. And here's again that admin report starts, admin report 5A. And it becomes a master list, so you can see if you've got duplicates, so that you need to edit and clean up. Adding activities then, we showed you those links. The Add Activity button shows on the Edit Action Plan page. The basic parts of page 1 is basically you could see activity type, national objective, our drop-downs, environmental assessment activity status, selecting project is a button. You saw selecting responsible organizations a button on page 2. But basically, you have to have those required information. That's why you need to go ahead and do those projects and activity responsible organizations first, because otherwise you're not going to be able to get to edit here. If you are a grantee admin user, this is the spot where you can actually block a draw. What would be the reason for that? You might have a completely separate finance department than you do your programmatic department. Your programmatic department might have said, I've got a finding against this, this local government or responsible organization. And your finance department might not know, don't process draws. So that button's there for grantee admin users, potentially to block a draw while something's, to prevent draws being inadvertently processed. So when you're on Edit Activity page, those are always good clues to know, if you've got a problem drawing with an activity, that's one of the places to check is on your View Action Plan or Edit Action Plan.
Another suggestion to use part of that block from the environmental staff, they suggested that it would log all activities until the environmental review record is complete.
So this is just showing the search project. Basically, it's, you've got the select project button, and once you hit that button, it's going to do a search screen. Just typically like everything else, you can put a partial title, partial project number in, and then you hit the radio button on the right, and then you hit select. The thing to be real careful about is that adjust project button on the bottom right. It's either your best friend or your worst enemy. At the very end of a grant, when you're fully budgeted, if you accidentally say, oh, I need to move this activity from one project to another, there's all these math rules that activity budgets can't exceed the grant amount and now the program income estimates. But the activity budgets can't exceed project budgets can't exceed the grant amount and now the PI. When people were moving things around, they couldn't edit that project budget because all those math rules would get hit up against. So that is, if you have the project budgets, and you need to move them around and reduce the one you're taking it from and increase the other one, then that's when you want to hit yes. But we get a lot of grantees that are confused and actually hit that button and end up overinflating their project budgets. So it's helpful every once in a while to use that search project function, or run a project level report and make sure that you haven't, somebody in your team hasn't accidentally inflated those, because we had that happen quite a bit. Again, here's one that shows naming conventions. There's codes there on the left, no codes on the right. But again, those are, I get questioned all the time, what do you want us to put in? And we're like, no, what do you want to put in? This is up to you. The proposed performance measures, one of the key things to remember is that the performance measures show up based on the activity type. Past that, they're based on what benefit type you picked. Is it area benefit, is it direct benefit, things like that. And we're going to go into those screens. And then whether or not you put in projections on the action plan side. Performance measures will not show up on the QPR if you don't put them in the action plan side. So we've got the activity types. One of the key things there is, again, area benefit versus direct benefit. Area benefit is typically going to be for things like infrastructure, public facilities, where it's census tract, block group data, or survey data. Direct benefit is you're going to keep income forms on the folks and track that way, or the people you're funding are, rather. So those are the two basic types. Those didn't exist in DRGR before the September 2010 release. The key thing to remember from that then is that the area benefit, those beneficiary measures, which are required, are only going to be on the action plan side. They're not going to show up on the QPR side. You don't have to edit them. If you select direct benefit, the race ethnicity screens that show up in the QPR will be required. In those cases, you'll put in the overall, housing numbers, housing units, owner, renter, single family, multifamily. The race ethnicity screens will be required for the owner, renter households on the QPR side. So the next slide just actually shows activity type. If there's area benefit versus direct benefit, like at the top where it's acquisition, you have an option. If it's something like homeowner and you only see direct benefit, that means that when you go into that edit activity page, you're not going to see an option. All you will see is the option for direct. So you won't be able to choose area benefit for those. So in all of these things, it's real important that you pick those. The performance measures, again, that show up, again, beneficiary measures and some of the activity measures are going to depend on you selecting those benefit types. So again, the area benefit type, we actually have a few different ways to get at that data. Again, there's the basic ones are census method or survey method. On the census, you can actually duplicate another activity. That just means duplicating the service area. Instead of I think in IDIS, you have to pick the tracks and block groups every single time. And so I thought, well, is there, typically I try to make sure that the DRGR navigation and look and feel is as similar as possible to IDS, unless it's going to save a lot of time. And so this is one of those instances I said, well, can we just copy the data over on the tracks, block groups, and then the data? So you can duplicate another activity. You can say the activity is going to benefit the whole jurisdiction, or you can then pick county code, and then if you do those, then you're going to pick census place, tracks, and the block groups. So here's an example of duplicating another activity. You check the box on the left, you say what's the activity number, you hit copy activity area, and then all that other data, the tracks and block groups will be identified, and so will the overall percent low mod. There's just a checkbox for service area, city or county-wide, no other actions needed. And if you're saying I'm going to pick tracks and block groups, then it's actually going to require that you would pick the county codes. So if you're a state, you're going to see the county codes from a whole state. If you're an entitlement area, then it should actually just show, whatever county you're in. We've preloaded them as much as possible from IDIS service areas. If you do not see the tracks and block groups, for new entitlement, I think we had issues with Cranston and Rhode Island and Warwick. And so if they don't show up for any reason, let us know, because then we'll have to probably do a data correction or correct that service area for you. So every once in a while we get that as an issue. Basically, the way they navigate then to pick the tracks and block groups is going to be first you pick the census places, and then that gives you the tracks. And then you'll select all the tracks. If you want the data to be calculated just at the track level only, you can hit Calculate Low Mod. If you're going to pick block groups, you can hit that next page, the button over there that says Select Block Groups. And then those are just checkboxes. And again, Calculate Low Mod. There is also another button there that says View Details. If you want to see the individual tracks and block groups and the low mod for each single one, that'll pop up a separate window. You can copy it into a Word document, save it in your files, whatever. But it's there, and it's always going to be there in DRGR. But it's kind of produced on the fly. So say you see that your low mod is not what you expected it to be, you can pull that list off and say, oh, I forgot these tracks and these block groups. That's why my numbers aren't adding up. Survey method, basically, it's just a simple manual entry. You still can pick the track and block groups, it just won't copy over the low mod data that we get from PD&R, the census tabulations. So basically, you see there under number of persons, it's going to say total, low, and mod. And then you see also the other type of things, the location description and activity description. Again, those are narratives with format and other areas to check, to make sure that you've not copied formatting in there. I think we already done that one. Direct benefit. So when you're doing the edit activity, I think it's page 2, one of the first things, again, you're checking area benefit versus direct benefit. Those will change what the bottom of the screen displays, And then if you check you won't see multifamily and single family unless you've already checked housing units. So again, the things that display below on the page are going to depend on what you've checked at the top of the page. So the types of things here, again, the breakouts for households are owner and renter. For housing units, it's single family and multifamily. And then the race, ethnicity, head of household data, all that comes on the QPR side. And this should be pretty similar, very similar to the IDS screens. And when it comes to monitoring, we're going to be using probably the same monitoring exhibits, that they do over there. I think it's based on the same, we try to base it on the same form. I think it's 27061 is the form. That's the standard, I guess, HUD form that the grantees use to collect the race ethnicity data from the Folk Shoe Fund. So here's another example of how the data will change. If you've only checked owner, you'll see under households, you'll only see an owner data field. Here we've only checked single family units under housing units. So you only have to put one thing of data in there. So you won't have to put in housing units and single family units. You won't have to put in owner and households. If you pick the data this way, where it's multiple combination, you will have to put in both, and it'll add it up on the action plan side. I think on the QPR side, you actually even have to put in totals, if I remember correctly, because you might have to do corrections across categories. So just as a reminder, this should be, everybody knows this certainly, but I've actually gone and monitored, and the low here is 0 to 50, moderate is 51 to 80. And then the thing that's confusing, if you're putting in total, say you're doing survey method, or you're doing households, is that you're not putting in the non-low mod. You're putting in the total amount. So if you need to calculate the the nominal mod. You're basically backing out low minus total. I mean total minus low and mod. So proposed accomplishments, this is important to remember. If you don't put in the actual goals, if you don't at least put a 0, we always encourage you to put in what you think you're going to do for the actual proposed accomplishments. But you have to put something in there, otherwise the measures will not show in the QPR, as even options. We always want you to put in those estimates because we actually have to pull reports and say, what is this appropriation going to do? And if we don't have that information, I know sometimes it's hard if we're making a split low and mod to urgent need. People are reticent to actually estimate those numbers. But, you can adjust, again, vouchers afterwards. You can adjust performance measures and actual accomplishments. We need those as much as possible because we actually have to run reports all the time for Congress, for the press. And if our programs look like you're not doing that much, kind of undersells what the benefit of the programs are going to be. So you can always go back in and change those, but that's a real pain if you're in the QPR and you have to go back to the action plan and get that readjusted, then it can be frustrating, to say the least. There's green measures in DRGR. So these are required under NSP 2. And what other appropriations, Jesse?
They're only required for NSP 2, but they show up for everybody.
Yeah. Right. They do show up for everything, and that kind of brings home a point. Just because there's a measure there doesn't mean that you have to report it. If something does not apply, does not apply to your activity, those are our standard measures. Those are things that if you only are going to collect, say it's tourism, if it's an event or versus it's a marketing thing where you're actually doing radio ads or spots or something, those things would be very different. You wouldn't want to fill in those measures for both types of activities. So, that's important not to, even though I'm trying to encourage you to put in estimates, only for the ones that apply to your particular activity.
Particularly the green measures, though, if you want to have like bragging rights, or if you've gone and retired green of as part of your program, then you want to put it in here and it'll show up as something you want to highlight about what you're doing. We are definitely doing that voluntarily.
So some of the handy reports to pull is projected versus cumulative totals. Again, so if you haven't selected a measure, that measure won't even show up here. And so this is something we actually look at a lot. Because we actually look to see, are your numbers drifting? When we're running numbers to say, here's what wonderful things Katrina Reader Wilma grants have done, we'll actually look to make sure that if you said you're going to do 100 units of multifamily, is it now saying 1,000? So one key thing to remember about your QPRs is you're putting the in-quarter accomplishments only. So it's very common for grantees to actually put in, oh, we're up to 70 people in this apartment complex now. Oh, now we've got 90. And they'll put in 70 and 90. So a lot of times it's good to keep an eye out on this report. Because if you want to know where the problem is, then we've got reports by quarter, and you can troubleshoot where it is. You can do an adjustment for a prior period in your QPR and put in negative numbers. At least I hope it is this week. Sometimes my functions disappear on me. So this is a real good report to run on a regular basis. Number one, it tells you how are you doing against your goals, but also tells you if we've got some kind of error in our reporting. And those things can jump out, in your QPR. But again, if your QPR is now 500 pages, it's something that it's difficult to look in a big old document. So if you want to look at one program at a time, and we'll cover this on the MicroStrategy session, is that you can, if you want to put in a responsible organization at the top or an activity type at the top, you could run and do a quality control on each one of those one at a time. And it makes it a little easier to see those patterns. Okay, so the drawdown module, this is the fun part. How do you get your money? So there's some basic steps in doing draws. And again, we mentioned that in order to do obligations, you have to have one of the draw rolls. Even if you're not going to do draws, you have to have a draw roll to do obligations. So basically, a draw requester is going to request a draw. Draw approver is going to have to approve it. In some cases, again, I think what's the standard threshold is 5 million, Jesse?
Standard threshold for a governmental grantee is $5 million a day before triggers an additional 100 review. There's no limit to how much you can do that day, however.
So,
you can request for a grant if you actually need it.
so some of our larger grants, we have higher thresholds, you know, the billion-dollar grants. Tennille, do we have, what kind of thresholds on some of the newer grants? Anything set that's specific? Okay. So it typically tends to be 5 million, and all that means is that we're going to get an automated email that says there's a draw pending headquarters approval. And the basic process for that is that your folks will send in something like a PDF of the invoice that shows at least 2 staff approvals. And that'll go, again, typically to Tennille. You can always CC Jesse and myself if, you know, you don't get a CC us, or, you know, route it to us if Tennille's not around. But basically, we're checking to make sure your numbers add up, make sure that there's 2 of the staff vouchers. We're not checking compliance, you know, is the activity eligible?
But what does it take people sometimes they do is they'll send us an invoice and say current activity is not on the ballot. That happens surprisingly often.
And the hardest part is actually, and we've gone around in circles a few different times with fee grantees, is that sometimes the things that are on your invoices don't match up. You know, the things that are on the individual line items and DRGR and activities. So typically the easiest thing to do in those cases is create a little table that shows, here's for these line items, you know, you've got line items in the row and the voucher numbers in a column, or vice versa, but just show something that shows the way that the things relate. Because again, we have to add up the numbers, and if the stuff doesn't make any sense to us, we'll go back.
Right. We have a service commitment on this too. We try to turn these around 24 hours after, within 24 hours after we get the documentation from you. So, and we can pretty much do that. It's a lot easier if you put the draw in at 9 a.m. and call us and send us the documentation than to hit the same day than if you send it in at 5 p.m. So try not to let it be a screaming emergency and then put the draw request in really late in the day.
Yeah, that would definitely help. So typically we don't know, you know, once that happens, though, our deadline is basically 8 p.m. at night for the draws to go to locks. So that's it for us. And then we don't know exactly how long it takes, but typically we hear 2 or 3 days is a routine amount of time for money to hit your bank accounts. So again, there's the obligation step. Grantees would have to search and then hit the maintain link to do the obligations. The vouchers, creating a new voucher, there's a few different steps. There's, you know, searching, or not searching, we hit the add button, hit the submit, confirm, and it actually has page 1, 2, 3, and 4. If you don't get to page 4, you don't have a draw. So, and if we're trying to troubleshoot, we always want you to send us kind of evidence that there's page 4, because it'll actually show a draw number on those other pages, but it's not going to actually be real until you actually hit 4 and confirm that extra time. And you can actually do things like revise vouchers, things like that. The basic rules we've got, again, are that for obligations is that the obligations are going to be anything from the activity budget, you know, down to the amount already existing draw. So you can edit your obligations up and edit them down. The screen is pretty simple. It used to show just total drawn, because draws and obligations used to only be affected by grant funds in DRGR. Now it also is affected by your program income. So unless you're working on an NSP grant, you don't need to worry about that too much. Or unless you've got program income on your disaster activity. We've got very few. I think under Katrina, Rita, Wilma, I think only Louisiana. I think, do we have program income? It just, again, depends on your program design. So it's very simple. You don't add incremental amounts. All you do is put in an overall amount and increase it or decrease it. So the total budget and the total drawn amount, those show there. And that is basically all you can do is edit that page that way. So again, we talked about multiple steps for creating vouchers. There's creating the voucher, improving the voucher. This is just a subset of that other screen that shows what are those draw rolls, just kind of pulled out. So you can see here one thing that sometimes people forget. Everybody can search for a voucher and view a voucher. Everybody can search for a receipt and view a receipt. Again, the only thing people that can create and edit program income accounts are going to be folks with the draw rights. It's moved to the draw module. We already talked about draw thresholds. We've talked about blocked draws. So we're going to walk real quickly through the voucher process. Basically, page 1 you see here is you're selecting and adding activities. So you've hit a create voucher link if you've got those rights. You hit add activities. You pick which grant or grants that you want under this draw. It can be multiple grants. And then you can put information, partial information again on the organization. I made organization a search term here because a lot of times people are processing invoices based on who's submitting a voucher. So you're getting a group of one from the same local government, processing one at a time. So basically, you have to identify you're going to use program funds and receipt funds. If you have program income, you're actually going to have to spend that money first, and we'll talk real quickly about how do you manage those within accounts. Once you do that, you can select more activities, add them in, and then once you hit that continue button, that's going to get you to page 2. It's going to show you how much you have available by fund type. It's very important to keep an eye on that fund type. If you've got program income, DRGR is going to pop up program income even though you didn't select it, because it's going to want to say, but you need to use your program income. So it's an easy mistake to make to actually do a draw that you thought was program funds, but it's actually program income. So if you click on the available amount, the number, like the 1.5 million on the second row, that will actually show the calculation for the available amount. And again, it's going to be drawn, it's going to take obligation minus drawn, is typically what it is going to be for most disaster grantees. And this is what the available balance calculation looks like. If you do have program income, and if you've set up any program income accounts or the general account, that available balance might end up on the program income. The program income. So that might be what shows up in that line of available balance. Typically, it's going to be what's your total funds available for that activity. But if it doesn't make sense, look to that program income account level, and it might say general account. Look to see if for some reason, is that what it's pushing me towards. And again, so here it looks like you've got a voucher. Look, I see a voucher number. Looks great. You're not on step 4. You don't have a real voucher. DRGR will not store that voucher number. When you go to search it, it won't find it. So once you hit page 4, and now you have also the ability to download PDF. I think that was new from September 2010. Or no, from December. I think we just added that function. And so you can actually print the vouchers. We actually used to be only approvers had comment fields. Now we have comment fields for people creating it. So if you need to make notes, you have that option there. And it used to be people would print the vouchers as proof, but so we created that download PDF function so you didn't have to worry about it being printed the right way on the page and cutting across pages. Other functions real quickly are cancel, revoke, and revise. Cancel, revoke are very similar in terms of it's before it's gone to be processed. If a draw has been processed already, you can revise the activities across the grant, revise draws across the grant, across activities. An approver is not going to have, again, that create voucher, but they're going to have to select and search and select. Let's see, go back. And so basically, once they've hit that search, you're going to see a maintain link on those. So it's not going to immediately take you to the approval screen. The maintain link will go to, the line item, the voucher number, things like that. Once you hit maintain, it's going to take you to the screen. And grantees, an approver has the ability to do approve multiple, reject some, approve some. So they don't always have to travel at the same rate. You might say 3 out of the 4 look good, but I don't have any, supporting documents for this one, and we've told them for months. So you have that option there to approve or reject some or all. This is an example of the PDF screen. And download, nothing fancy. If you want to find out whether or not something's been processed by locks, go back and hit the view link there on the right-hand side. Again, almost everybody has those rights to view. HUD staff, all grantees, regardless of whether I have draw rolls. So if you're trying to figure out what the heck has happened to my my draw, you can see here on the right-hand side locks confirmation information and locks update data. That will tell you what's happened, has it been processed, did it get accepted. So the basic status, again, is if it's something that's pending approval, it'll say open. If it's something that's actually been approved and gone to locks, it'll say complete. It can be a little confusing. And so if you're part of the finance department, And Denise was talking about, this is the report I was talking about earlier, mentioning with Denise. This is a master list of vouchers. It shows the status. So it could be the reason you don't have something paid out is because it's still in open status. The most confusing part here is that revised column. Revising a voucher, we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but basically if you've got ineligible funds, if you made an error, if you said, oh my goodness, that person's not that income level that we thought they were, and I need to move money across from the LM to the UN or vice versa, then revised voucher is your friend. Now a revised voucher also allows you to do it to multiple activities. So if we've asked you to restructure activities, you'll be able to do that with the current revised voucher screen. Even if you do wire funds back because something's ineligible, LOCKSS will send it back to the grant level. It won't know what activity it's going to. So when it comes in as a collection, which will show as a negative amount, you'll actually still even have to revise it back to that activity to increase that available balance on that activity. So you have to use that same screen. So we've got basically one of the improvements here. We've got available balances to show. You'll be able to add multiple ones, and it'll show how much is still left on an activity. So that's basically the revised voucher. I'm not going to cover these, but again, we've talked about revolving loan fund projects and program income accounts. Basically, those are tools for you if you do have program income, so that if you get, you're allowing people to retain, local governments to retain program income for any reason, it allows you to insulate each group, so that program income you receive on one don't affect draws on another. Those program income accounts will show up on the top right. If it's not assigned, it's called general account. So that just means that it's never been assigned. And that means those program income received on any activity will affect all the others. Create receipts in the drawdown function too. Not very dissimilar to other things. Basically, if you have a receipt date that shows for an old QPR, it will affect, especially if it's an approved one, your people that are admin users, grantee admin users will be frustrated because I send an email to them and the CPD reps, or the system does, saying your program income that was in this old QPR has changed. So it's a real pain when it comes to cleaning the data up, potentially. But on an ongoing basis, it's something that it won't happen. You shouldn't have that many edits. So program income account, basically, it's a lot like that census screen. You're picking who the organization is and what activities apply to that program income account. So QPR module, we don't have a whole lot of data now that's actually being edited in there. You're reporting accomplishments, progress. DRGR is taking a snapshot of financial data. The field office role is basically approving and rejecting. Again, you can't edit the QPR if if the action plan's in, you can edit it, you can't submit it. And yeah, any kind of edits to the action plan end up getting locked. Same, we're going to skip this slide because that's the same rules. This just talks about the data sources. You can see what comes from the action plan, what's a snapshot from the drawdown, and then what is actually being put in on the QPR side. So the most part you can see is expenditures match and accomplishments. And other than that, it should say visit count, and if you're on this page, it should say report count, not issue count. So overall, you're going to be showing what's your overall progress financially. What are your targets and your goals? Data gets added up from the activities. When you're adding a QPR, you actually have to manually add it. Your first one will be prompted. Past that, if you don't continue to add them, DRGR won't add them for you. So you can get behind. If you're missing a QPR, if it doesn't show, the QPR begin date, look at the bottom because there'll be a little button that says add missing QPRs. Typically, that's only if you had no draws or obligation updates during the quarter. DRGR doesn't add the QPR automatically. You still are required to report every quarter. So there's a little add missing button on that one. So basically, you're going to add some overall progress narrative. On accomplishments, again, you've got the standard performance measures that you identified in your action plan. If there's any non-standard measures, feel free to use your progress narrative to type those in. We're not going to add non-standard activity measures. If something is something every grantee should be reporting, we'll certainly consider it. But other measures that you say you want to write how many mobile homes or modular homes or stick-built. Those are kind of things that we get requests for, but if we put them in, then every grantee would think we were wanting that data for them, so we don't. But by all means, use your progress narrative to put those kind of information in. So we talked about the sources of the financial data. Addresses is a little confusing for folks. Are we still mainly just on the disaster side? We typically just do buyouts.
Yeah, we need to buy out completion.
Yeah. So it's a little bit different than NSP, because in NSP, we exit for all single family. So if you got somebody on both sides, they might tell you, oh no, you've got to put all single family in there.
What I don't know actually, because I forgot to check the notice for this, is whether this is around the funding fee or you can be asking for addresses in that activity measure. I know there was one thing that got discussed, but I wasn't sure.
We're asking for geographic details, but not addresses.
So when you get to the actual edit performance report and edit activity page 1, you'll actually see spots for the race ethnicity data if it's a direct benefit activity. So you'll have to add each race ethnicity category. You can see Hispanics separate. Here, in this case, somebody selected owner only. The income level data is put in separately than the, sorry, yeah, I'll try to whip through these as quick as I can here. The race ethnicity data and the income level data are entered separately. What's confusing here is if you've got adjustments, if you've readjusted and picked a different activity type or measure, like single family later on, the numbers will get out of kilter. And so it's your cumulative totals. You might get an error message that says your cumulative totals match. It's not those cumulative totals shown on the page. It's your cumulative totals across all QPRs. So your income levels and your race ethnicity data have to add up on the cumulative side. This is what the address level data looks like. Under the last release, we actually added geocoding, and so you have the ability to actually check and try to clean up the data. The thing it doesn't handle well is if you forget north, south, east, west. If you forget drive or street, it does pretty good with that. You can see if you detail, you can view it on a map. Here's those other performance measures. And so anything that's on the direct benefit, it'll end up being read-only, from the data you put in that race ethnicity data. So on the financial data, again, you can see here, you're going to put in, if you put subordinate organizations in, you'll have to put expenditures under each one. If you only put one, you only put it in one time. Match, again, we don't have, this is where we're saying, if you put in all those different funding sources up front, all we have is this one field. So if you're wanting to show leverage, this is the only kind of place we can use it as a workaround. So this is what a view QPR looks like, or print QPR. And a typical activity description, location description, and how the performance measures show. So you'll see total expected, and you'll see the income breakouts. We're going to skip through the prior period adjustments, and we can talk through that real quick. I'm going to go super quick. I'm not going to go into any detail in the admin module. All right, so yeah. In a nutshell, you add events, you add findings and concerns. But basically, it's your admin module. The main thing to remember is that that's for you to put in data on who you monitor, who you have audits for, and any technical assistance you do. So under the disaster recovery, most of our appropriations, basically we've said that you're supposed to report what you're doing to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. This is where you do it. So that's why we've added those screens. Those came in about April 2010.